he will be.
We love this guy, Jen.
We begin this hour with breaking news from London. The British terror threat level has been raised to critical, meaning another attack may be imminent after this morning's rush hour subway bombing. An urgent manhunt is underway for the bomber or bombers. No one has been arrested. At least 29 people were injured when the improvised device exploded on a crowded subway train. You see it still burning in a photograph that was widely circulated. Sources say the device had a timer and likely contained the powerful explosive TATP. Let's get Matthew Chance now in London. Matthew, what's the latest on the manhunt?
Especially for South Florida today.
Well, you can see the situation is still very tight in terms of security on the streets of London. It's 1 a.m. Local time, and this police cordon behind me, just a short distance from Parsons Green tube station, is still very much in force, although it looks like the police are starting to move it away at this point. The authorities say they're making, in their words, excellent progress in their investigation, but they're being very tight-lipped about what exactly that progress is. They haven't named any suspects. They haven't arrested anybody as far as we're aware at this point, and we don't know sort of the extent of their investigations. They're saying there's a heavy element of covert work being done in this investigation. In the meantime, as you mentioned, the country has raised its terror threat level to critical, meaning there's a possibility, they believe there's a possibility of an imminent terrorist attack, another terrorist attack, and that's a function of the fact that the individual or the individuals responsible for this Parsons Green metro station bombing is still very much at large.
And Matthew, ISIS has claimed responsibility, even though the attacker is still on the loose,
right? To have a voice in who they're
Yes, they have. The news agency affiliated with ISIS has issued a statement saying that a detachment of ISIS soldiers carried out the bomb attack. So it's sort of implying there was more than one individual concerned. But, you know, first of all, that's been played down by the British authorities. The Metropolitan Police here in London say, look, you know, it's routine for ISIS to claim responsibility for attacks like this, not just in Britain, but elsewhere in Europe and in the broader world. And on many of those occasions, there's simply not any evidence at all to actually connect the people who carry out these attacks with ISIS directly. And so the authorities are waiting for more information from the actual suspects before they jump to any conclusions or accept any claims of responsibility from any group.
And the so-called bucket bomb that was found on the train, the fact that it seems to be intact, obviously that would give some clues to investigators to work on. What have you learned about it?
Passion to make something original.
Well, the bucket bomb, the bucket is not the ideal receptacle for a bomb because of its open-ended nature. And I think that's a sign of how crude this device was. It was also inside a sort of thermal shopping bag as well when it was placed on the train. So it was a very crude device. It didn't go off properly. It didn't explode. Fortunately for the passengers on board, it just simply sort of burst into flames and caused some burns. 29 people have been treated in hospital for those burns. But it was an ambitious bomb because there was a timer device that was on it, a timed detonator. And so the ambition was for this bomb to be able to cause mass casualties. And there was some sophistication put into constructing it through this timer device. It just wasn't successful from the terrorist point of view.
Yeah, thankfully on that. Matthew Chance, thanks very much. Joining me now is former House Intelligence Committee Chairman and CNN National Security Commentator Mike Rogers and CNN terrorism analyst Paul Cruikshank. Just in terms of the bomb itself, again, the fact that it didn't work is a huge blessing for investigators in order to sort of figure out the signature of the maker if they've seen one like this before.
That's absolutely right. They're doing the forensics right now at the Defence Science and Technology Labs. That's in Wiltshire. They're excellent at this kind of analysis, and they're going to figure out what kind of device it was, whether there are any bomb signatures which might lead back to a particular bomb maker. The reason they're at critical alert right now is because they believe the bomb maker is still at large, could still put together more devices. But you're right, this was essentially a dud bomb. The initial assessment was that there was a likelihood it contained TATP. They're trying to confirm that now with all that forensics, and so we'll wait to see whether that is indeed confirmed. But TATP has been used in ISIS terrorist attacks in Paris and Brussels and Manchester, and also when those Barcelona plotters just a few weeks ago were trying to put together devices in a bomb factory and they blew themselves up. That was TATP as well. And actually this detail, very interesting detail about this thermal bag is very significant potentially because TATP is very, very sensitive, and so you've got to keep it cool, otherwise it could go off prematurely. And one of the scenarios they're looking at is this might have gone off prematurely because it got jostled on the train, or it was too hot and it was meant to go off deeper into London. Parsons Green's right on the outer band of London. If you're a terrorist trying to pull off an attack like this, you would presumably want to carry out that attack nearer the centre of London.
Chairman Rogers, what stands out to you as you look at this?
It's going to be really interesting on the forensics of the bomb. Did they find any shrapnel-type devices wrapped around it? A lot of times they'll put items, including ball bearings, nails, glass, in order to inflict more damage at the explosion. And it doesn't sound like they've done that. So it looks to me like they were either A, in a hurry, or B, didn't follow the instructions very well on the bomb-making process. So what I think you're going to find is that this was probably someone that was a lone wolf that was not directly attached and communicating regularly to ISIS, but may have in fact been radicalized.
You know, British authorities haven't said much about the progress on the investigation, but I mean, given the number of security cameras that exist all over London, and you think there are a lot in New York, London has far, far more and has for many years. You know, somebody entering that subway station or any subway station, you would think by this point would have been at least, they would have a visual on this person because they're carrying this device in a thermal bag.
Absolutely right. In fact, every train carriage in the UK, the subway, has CCTV, so they'll be able to pick him up inside the carriage along the station. They'll be able to go back in time to see what streets he walked on in the hours before. They might even be able to go all the way back to wherever he emerged early in the morning to put this device on the train. So that will be an absolutely critical part of this investigation.
And the first thing that the investigators talked about was bringing on more people to do that forensics of the video. Not as easy as you think. It's not as maybe automated as we would like it to be. So it still takes a lot of eyes on a screen to make that track and to follow that track and not to miss anything on that track. So when they say it's a covert investigation at that point, I'm sure this is good old-fashioned gumshoe investigative work. And then they're also tickling their sources out in the community.
In terms of raising the threat level, you know, the British government raised the threat level. I just want to play what Prime Minister Theresa May had to say.
It was a very good debate.
The Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, that's the independent organisation which is responsible for setting the threat level on the basis of available intelligence, has now decided to raise the national threat level from severe to critical. This means that their assessment is that a further attack may be imminent.
What does that actually do? I mean, raising the threat level?
I just think it puts people on alert. People will be more vigilant about picking up the phone, saying something doesn't look right. For the investigators and for the security forces, it doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't trigger like an automatic, like emergency response, like, okay, automatically now funding is. It's not like
no, not necessarily. No, but what it is doing is telling the general public that, hey, listen, this is we haven't caught him yet. Maybe we think there's either one or others who are out there who are still dangerous. And by the way, pick up the phone and call. As far as the investigators go, anytime they have this and don't have a suspect immediately identified, in their minds, they're already there. They're already at this heightened level of doing everything that they can to fan out across the community to find the folks who are guilty of it.
Just one extra point is that they have brought in some military now in the UK to replace some of the duties of the armed police. They freed up to about 1,000 armed police over the week.
That's why they came to this conclusion.
Unless it was intended to be and just the device went off before.
Yeah, maybe. You know, there's always a possibility. He's one of the 29 people in the hospital.
You know, the president also tweeted out, you know, he called it a terror attack, and he tweeted out that these people, whoever was responsible, was, quote, in the sights of Scotland Yard. Theresa May, of course, said that's, you know, not very helpful to speculate in the midst of an investigation. Does that, I mean, do you think he was briefed on that, or do you think he's just saying that?
Yeah, I think he just said it. I don't, candidly, it wasn't helpful. I don't think it hurt the investigation. It just isn't helpful. And it gets people pointing fingers early.
Even if he had been briefed on it, I don't get why he would go on Twitter and give out details of an investigation in those early hours.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that detail would do anything different to the investigation. It just wasn't helpful. And it allows people who are the naysayers to say, see, you missed another one. He may, in fact, have been trying to be helpful in an odd way, where he's saying, listen, they kind of knew about it and they slipped through the cracks, and we're all going to do a better job. You know, that's being magnanimous. I never think it's helpful for any public official to get ahead of the investigation. It's just never helpful to do that.
I think it needs
to
be
Paul Cruikshank, Chairman Rogers, thanks very much. Following the attack in London, the New York Police Department boosted security for the city's transit system. The city has more than 665 miles of subway tracks. Nearly 6 million people ride the subways each weekday. Earlier today, outside a nearby subway stop, I talked to the NYPD's Chief of Counterterrorism, James Waters. So because of what happened in London, have you changed something here in New York today?
So what we did is increased our police presence, mostly in the transit facilities throughout the entire city subway system.
Yeah, we just went down there and there were like 4 or 5 police officers standing in their turnstiles.
So what we're looking to do is we take the information from the London authorities. The New York City Police Department's Intelligence Bureau has a detective assigned there full-time.
Actually, it's based in London.
Based in London.
So if there's an attack, you immediately try to learn all you can about the methods, the technique of the terror.
Exactly. So that detective provides us with real-time information for what's happening over there from the crime scene in partnership with the New Scotland Yard and the UK police. Provides that information to us so that we can better deploy in New York City. He gets that New York City question answered.
Is that the idea of that is that the techniques or the strategies used by terrorists or anybody are constantly evolving. Sometimes, you know, it's one kind of explosive, another time it's an active shooter situation. So as they evolve tactics, you want to evolve response?
So we need to be keeping up or be ahead of them in those truck rammings, vehicle rammings of pedestrians, active shooter situations. And so we need to know what they're doing over there and to be able to deploy here in New York City. We're going to get that information from our partners in the UK through either the federal government Joint Terrorist Task Force and our liaison person. We're going to understand what the components were, what went right or wrong with that explosive, so we can better protect New York.
But something like, you know, I don't want to cause alarm, but something like, you know, a subway, which is an enclosed space, you can't check the bags of everybody going to a subway or a movie theater, you know.
We have to strike a balance between, you know, security and privacy. I think we do that very well here in New York with venues like sporting arenas and all. They do check bags and packages, but the subway system where millions of people ride each day,
it wouldn't be practical.
It wouldn't be practical.
Right.
It would be terrible inconvenience to the public.
So you also have sort of pre-deployed, very well-armed, very well-trained officers throughout the city at all times.
Yeah, so in the last 2 years, in the wake of the tragedies and the terrorist attacks in Paris, we developed a critical response command, 525 elite, highly trained counterterrorism officers who are out here deployed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with the long guns and the equipment, and they're trained to deal with any kind of incident that may occur.
And what's the idea of having them pre-deployed on the streets and also very visible on the streets?
We're looking for an omnipresence. We're looking to do a few things. We're looking to send a message to anybody that is doing pre-operational surveillance or looking to do harm to us, that this is not the place to do that. Go somewhere else. Don't do it at all, but go somewhere else. And also to give some confidence to the general public. New Yorkers and tourists and people that come and do business here have earned the right to have a healthy understanding of what the police do and have confidence in the police.
In active shooter situations, most of the fatalities that occur within the first couple of minutes. Is having police officers, heavily armed police officers pre-deployed in areas, it's a faster response time.
Right. So we know from active shooters that the shooting occurs in the first couple of minutes.
I think the first 6 minutes when the FBI stats.
And the death and the serious injuries are inflicted at that point. Having officers pre-deployed in locations to quickly respond and neutralize a shooter saves lives.
What's your message to the New Yorkers, to people visiting New York?
I think the message is clear. Live your life. but have a sense of awareness of what's around you. And if something doesn't seem right, report it to the police. New York City Safe, 311, and if it's an emergency, 911.
It's the old see something, say something.
See something, say something.
Two-parters, thank you.
Oh, great.
Well, as we mentioned, the president tweeted about the London attack this morning, speculating in the earliest hours of the investigation. The Prime Minister of Great Britain said that's never helpful. We'll have more on that next. Also had protests in St. Louis after a judge today found a former police officer not guilty in the killing of an African-American man in 2011. You're looking at live pictures. Protests have been going on throughout the day. Protests got violent, then dispersed. Now people have gathered again, are marching. We'll take you there live. Plus, the president targets ESPN anchor Jemele Hill online, what he tweeted about her, and the latest on that coming up. We're keeping an eye on the streets of St. Louis, where protesters are marching after today a former police officer was acquitted in the death of a black man, a case from 2011. We'll take you to St. Louis and have the backstory on the case ahead tonight. But first, President Trump, who tweeted this morning, just hours after that improvised explosive device we were just talking about injured 29 people in London. The president tweeted this, quote, "Another attack in London by a loser terrorist. These are sick and demented people who were in the sights of Scotland Yard. Must be proactive." He also tweeted this, quote, "The travel ban in the United States should be far larger, tougher, and more specific, but stupidly, that would not be politically correct." This was before 7 o'clock this morning. It hadn't even been 4 hours since the attack. The British investigation was in the earliest of stages, and British authorities had not been publicly discussing details of it. Here's what British Prime Minister Theresa May said when asked if the president knew something that everyone else didn't.
I never think it's helpful for anybody to speculate on what is an ongoing investigation. As I've just said, the police and security services are working to discover the full circumstances of this cowardly attack and to identify all those responsible.
Well, joining me now is former Missouri GOP chairman and Trump supporter Ed Martin and CNN senior political commentator and former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm. Governor, does it make sense to you that President Trump would get on the Twitter machine and punch this thing out early this morning?
Of course not. I mean, 23 minutes earlier, he had seen a segment on another cable show that he always watches, and they were speculating. The Times of London this evening confirmed that, in fact, he had no knowledge of what was going on. So he's just engaged in this sort of trigger-happy twittering that he does. He did the same thing in June, I think it was, when there was the other attack. In
the Philippines, right? It turned out to be a robbery that it was 3 months ago, right?
Yes.
Right,
And
he said it was a terror attack.
And the same thing on the previous terror attack in London. Well, it was what I'm talking about right now is the trigger-happy nature of it, how quickly he responds before getting the information, whether it ends up being a terrorist attack or not. So he's doing this. He did this in Paris. He did it in San Bernardino. He did it, in the Philippines. He did it here twice. And it's, I mean, what Theresa May didn't say, but what certainly these intelligence services suggested was this is not helpful. Mike Rogers said it earlier here. It's not only not helpful, but it's dangerous. What if they needed to keep information close about this person? He didn't have the information, but nobody who's reading his tweet knows that.
Ed, I mean, I know you're a Trump supporter. Yeah. Is it appropriate that the president would weigh in on this by saying that these guys were already on the radar of Scotland Yard?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more than appropriate. I mean, look, guys, there's you talked about 2 tweets, Anderson, and I think there are really 2 points in there that are really wonderful and important, and it's great the president's making them. The first is these terrorists are losers. I mean, one of the things the president has done is call the people that are doing this losers. ISIS has claimed this now, and one of the things we're trying to say is if you want to be a loser, want to be somebody who's not fitting in society, go do this kind of stuff. That's, by the way, very powerful to get people to understand that. But the second thing,
just a second on that, do you think would-be terrorists are cowed by the thought of being called a loser by Donald Trump?
No, I think that millions, tens of millions of Americans and people in the world are following the leader. It may not be always palatable to you or to Jennifer or anybody else, but they follow a leader. He's a prominent leader, and I think it's true when you see people that are doing this kind of thing. Suicide bombers, he called them losers.
Right.
It was powerful, but
to the governor's point about tweeting before you have all the information, or even if you do have information while an investigation and British authorities have not gone down that road. Is that
well,
wise?
I mean, I think, look, I don't think it was anything too specific, but let me, go to the second point. Jennifer was Attorney General in Michigan in 9/11. You certainly are a New Yorker. We know that immigration and breaking immigration laws is what led the terrorists to attack America. They were able to do it. So when the president points to the fact that we've got to have tougher, not politically correct anymore, but tougher rules to stop these bad guys, these losers, the American people, by the way, look up and are happy. And in Europe, people in Britain, they voted for Brexit, and also people at the EU are saying, when are we going to get leaders like Trump that are on our side first?
People are not happy when an investigation is potentially jeopardized, and I would wonder why. Wait. I was going to say, I would wonder why the president didn't text about the losers in Charlottesville until 3 days later, or the losers in Minnesota with the Muslims who are attacked at the mosque.
You're changing the subject.
Or why didn't he?
Well, actually, let me just play. You brought up Charlottesville. Let me play what the president was criticized for not commenting sooner, and obviously what he did comment. This is why he explained himself for not commenting sooner. Let's play this.
It was very important to me to get the facts out, and correctly. I couldn't have made it sooner because I didn't know all of the facts. It takes a little while to get the facts. I had to see the facts. I want to know the facts. I want the facts. I wanted to see the facts. Before I make a statement, I need the facts. You don't make statements that direct unless you know the fact. I want to make a statement with knowledge. I wanted to know the facts. Okay.
So, Ed, I mean, do you believe he knows the facts when he tweeted this morning?
No, but listen, listen, I really want you to let me make this whole point. When he commented on Charlottesville, he did it from New Jersey on a Saturday afternoon in real time, and he didn't do it well enough. We all agree. And when he was saying I needed to get more facts, it was in the days after. Today, this morning, he made a point this morning, a very important point, but he did not jeopardize the investigation. He didn't put any more specifics. He put the pressure on the right places, and he's not commenting on specifics. So it may be not our style, and we may wish a president never tweeted again, but I like it, and most Americans do. And again, I think it pushed the debate in a direction. There's no downside. Theresa May is not, she's dealing with it. It's not jeopardizing investigations, and I just think it's really a very helpful way to
Does
engage.
it hurt? I mean, obviously, their closest ally relations aren't going to be, severely hurt, but she certainly doesn't seem thrilled with the comment.
Of course she's not thrilled. I mean, she said so today, and she had criticized him after Charlottesville. When you go out and do things that embarrass or jeopardize a potential investigation as the leader of the free world, that is not a good thing. But the other point I just wanted to make is that he's such an opportunistic tweeter. He only tweets on something when it furthers his agenda. So you notice both after this incident and after the London attack that he did tweet about, both of the times he linked it to his travel ban. However, let's be really clear. In Minnesota, in August, there was a terrorist attack on a mosque. He did not tweet about that. In June,
he doesn't tweet about everything.
Well, of course, he only tweets. That's my point. Is he only tweets about the things that that affect his particular agenda. It seems he doesn't have a responsive chord or a sense of empathy when it doesn't impact his agenda. This is all about Donald Trump once again.
Okay, Ed, you get the final word.
Well, I mean, I just think, again, I point to things like you can be upset about his choice of tweeting, he comment others, but when he goes to Houston the first time, people say he wasn't empathetic enough. The second time, I think we all agree, there was a man fully engaged in the community, black community, African Americans. It made a difference. I mean, if you'd like him to tweet more about other terrorist acts, I bet he would. But I just think it's really leadership. And by the way, more Americans, not popular vote, but more Americans electoral college-wise voted for his vision. That means something too, right, Jennifer?
Not more Americans tweeted. No, not more Americans voted for him. Let's be clear.
Electoral.
But she got more votes.
Ed Martin, thank you, Jennifer. Governor Granholm as well. Coming up, we're going to take you to the streets of St. Louis, where protesters started gathering earlier today after a former police officer was acquitted for the 2011 shooting death of an African-American man. The crowds dispersed for a little bit. This was, is this a live shot or is this earlier? Okay, this is now live. That was it earlier today. It seems like demonstrators are back now. They're marching. We'll take you there next. On the streets tonight after a police officer is acquitted in the death of an African-American man. It's of course a scene that's played out over and over again in this country over the years. This time, the city of St. Louis where today a judge found former officer Jason Stockley not guilty of first-degree murder for fatally shooting Anthony Lamar Smith back in 2011. Now, shortly after the ruling, protests started in downtown St. Louis. CNN's Dan Simon is there. He joins us now. So explain the situation right now, Dan.
Well, Anderson, we are walking right now with a couple hundred protesters. We are in the central west end of St. Louis, and this has all been spontaneous. This has not been planned, and it appears that this group now is attempting to shut down a freeway. It was a very tense afternoon when you saw clashes between protesters and police. The question is, what's going to happen tonight? Of course, the elephant in the room is, are we going to see something in St. Louis like what we saw in Ferguson, Missouri? That is very much on everybody's mind tonight. But I can tell you that authorities are prepared. The National Guard is on standby. Police are working 12-hour shifts. Some vacations have been called off. And it's a very tense situation, I'll tell you that. This group looks very peaceful, but what we saw earlier outside the courthouse, we saw protesters throwing rocks at police, throwing bottles, and that's when police started using pepper spray and made several arrests. Again, we're just walking up this freeway overpass, and I guess we'll see what happens. Forgive me, I'm a little out of breath because we just ran to catch up with this group, Anderson.
So, Dan, I mean, is there kind of a central organization behind this? I mean, you said it was spontaneous. I mean, is somebody sort of determining, okay, this is where we're going to go now? And is somebody trying to help keep order? Because oftentimes protesters will try to, keep watch over each other and sort of try to keep things orderly.
Well, when things broke up outside of the courthouse this afternoon, we had received word that they were going to come to this section of town, and I assume it got spread via social media. But it wasn't like when they woke up this morning, we're going to meet at this particular location in the event of a verdict. This has all been unfolding really within the past hour or so once things broke out at the courthouse.
And
so
Dan,
you see,
is there a heavy police? Is there a heavy police presence where the protesters are now, or since it's rolling, are the police just kind of following along?
Right now, they're taking a hands-off posture. You can see you have police over here on the side. Obviously, they don't want to shut down the freeway because that's really going to disrupt things. I don't know what's going to happen if and when they do try to go onto the freeway itself. It's going to be something to watch this, but you can see police just casually standing off on the side. Clearly, they don't want to escalate things, and this crowd is acting peacefully, as you can see.
All right, Dan, we're going to continue to check in with you throughout the evening as we keep an eye on that situation. I want to give you some background on the case that they are protesting about. Our Randy Kay reports.
You're watching the final moments of a man's life. It's December 2011. And motorist Anthony Lamar Smith is being chased by St. Louis police officer Jason Stockley and his partner. The officers suspected he'd been involved in a drug deal. The officers would later say when they approached Smith, he jumped in his car and drove off, hitting the police cruiser and knocking Officer Stockley sideways. The officer fires several shots, saying he feared for his life and the safety of others. The high-speed chase tops 80 miles per hour. During the pursuit, Stockley is heard saying, "Going to kill this blank. Don't you know it?" It's difficult to hear on the dashcam video, but court documents say that's what he said. The chase ends with a crash, which Smith survives. But when officers approach, an internal report says Stockley ordered Smith to show his hands and that he thought he saw Smith reach for a handgun. Officer Stockley fires 4 shots. Anthony Smith is struck in the chest and dies at the scene. An internal report says Officer Stockley entered Smith's car to locate the weapon and render it safe and remove the ammunition from a silver revolver. According to the criminal complaint, forensic analysis revealed that only Officer Stockley's DNA was on the gun he said belonged to Smith. Officer Jason Stockley is relieved of his duties and charged with first-degree murder.
We all knew what it was when it happened. There couldn't have been any doubt about it. I knew that it was murder from the beginning.
Stockley's murder trial started last month. The key question, whether or not the motorist, Smith, had a gun at the time of the shooting. Prosecutors argued that the ex-officer may have planted the revolver in the car to justify the shooting. Even though multiple cameras captured the incident, the gun was never seen. Still, in his not guilty ruling, Judge Timothy Wilson said the gun would have been too large for Stockley to hide and then plant. The judge said he'd reviewed the video footage innumerable times, and that just because Smith's fingerprints weren't on the gun didn't mean the driver didn't touch the gun. Judge Wilson was left to determine whether the killing was intentional or lawful use of deadly force by an officer acting in self-defense. Randy Kaye, CNN, New York.
And as you saw, there's a lot of, obviously, outrage and reaction to this. We saw those protests earlier today, and now this is a live picture from KTVI. It's 7:37 there in St. Louis. Several hundred people. It's hard to get a sense of the actual total number, but Dan Simon, who is there somewhere in the crowd, said it's about several hundred people, and he believes that they were trying to stop or cross over a freeway to kind of cut off the freeway as a protest, which is obviously something we have seen. Dan, what's going on right now?
Well, we're just standing on top of this freeway overpass, and right now the crowd is not attempting to go on the freeway. It looks like they're headed towards some apartment buildings, actually. And right now you can see there are just a number of police vehicles here. Traffic has really slowed down as obviously drivers are wondering what's going on. And looks like the crowd is moving. They're going on to sort of a grassy area, and I don't really think they have much of a plan, Anderson. I think they're just making it up as they go. But right now, police not attempting to interfere. They're just kind of letting the crowd go as they please.
And we're looking at two different shots, so it's a little hard to tell one in relation to the other. You're on, just so I'm clear, Dan, I believe your camera is on the left-hand side of the screen, and where we see the flashing police lights. You're on an overpass of the highway, is that correct?
This is actually a freeway entrance. Exactly. You can see a number of people just standing on it. You can see this police vehicle blocking the crowd. So here's what's going on. You can see that the officers are clearly trying to keep the crowd from going onto the freeway. You see the police in full riot gear. Obviously, this is what's preventing people from actually going on to the highway. And the crowd now is pushing just straight in front of us over this grassy hill here, and I don't know where they're going. That appears to be a residential area, and right now we're just waiting to see how this unfolds, Anderson.
And the camera on the right side of your screen, which is an affiliate camera, again, just kind of giving you a broader overview. I believe Dan is to the left on where the area that he is in, but it looks like traffic has been stopped on that freeway, maybe out of concern that people are going to come on, but again, it's a little hard to tell. We're going to continue to follow the situation. We have a reporter, Dan Simon, there. Actually, you're seeing there some lights from a helicopter kind of lighting up, illuminating where the crowd seems to be going. They seem to be walking. Dan was saying it's potentially in a residential neighborhood. It's hard to tell, Dan, just where you are in relation to this other camera that we're seeing, which is more of an overview shot, but it does look like there's a large crowd of people moving down what appears to be more of a residential street.
Yeah, it's definitely a residential area. I can see some of the homes or apartments in front of me. There appears to be a church over here. And now we see two big busloads of police officers to my right here. Jim, can you pan the camera over here? See those buses right there? Full of police officers getting out. Again, police don't know really where this crowd is going. So it is beginning to be a tense situation. Obviously, if they flood into some of these residential areas, that's going to cause some major concern, and that's where you might have to see police intervene, Anderson.
Right. Dan, we'll continue checking with you. Former St. Louis Alderman Antonio French joins us on the phone. He was actually an eyewitness to the car chase which resulted in that shooting, or ended with that shooting. Antonio, can you just explain I mean, this was a shooting which took place in 2011. My understanding is that there was new information that is the reason this case ended up going to court. Is that correct?
Well, first let me correct you. It's kind of strange, but I am not the Antonio French who was a witness to the case.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that.
Antonio French.
I do know. Yes, you are the former St. Louis alderman who I've met many times. Okay, good. Yes,
that's right.
Apologize. I thought that was a very odd coincidence, by the way. But
yeah.
But why was this case brought now when this shooting took place in 2011?
Well, that is a good question. The former circuit attorney brought these charges before she left office. And I think it was due to the DNA evidence, video evidence. I am not sure exactly what happened different, but there had been pressure for quite a while, giving all the evidence that this was a case that could actually, meet the threshold of Missouri state law, which is very high to convict a police officer of murder. But the former prosecutor and the current prosecutor both felt that they had a good case. And looking at the evidence, especially some of the statements from the officer, again, saying that he was going to kill this MF just before he actually did, we felt that this was a case that could be won, and we're disappointed with today's verdict.
Shot 5 times while he was in the vehicle. There was a weapon found, but the accusations against the officer was that he had planted the weapon. His DNA, and only his DNA, I believe traces only of his DNA were found on the weapon. He claimed that he touched the weapon while executing a search.
Yeah, so it's a couple of things. One, as you said, the weapon only had the officer's DNA. But then there's video evidence from the police car, both the dash and the backseat camera, that shows the officer go to his bag and get something and then take it back by himself to the car. And so, the prosecutors believe that this was a clear case of a gun being planted, an officer having premeditation to kill this suspect, and people are very frustrated by tonight's verdict.
I'm wondering just if you could give us a sense over the last several months, the last year or so since Ferguson, which is when I think many people met you for the first time in terms of seeing you on television and hearing your voice nationally. What has changed? What has not changed in the St. Louis area?
Well, sadly, I would say not enough has changed. We find ourselves in the same frustrating position here, where people are still going to the streets demanding the same thing that they demanded back in 2014, which is accountability. People want to have faith in the system and know that if an officer takes a life, that there is some level of accountability, and people are not feeling that that is happening. If there is something positive that has changed, is that there is more awareness about the issue, but awareness without action doesn't mean much. And you're seeing tonight, people taking to the streets once again to let the world know that we want change in the city.
Well, former St. Louis Alderman Antonio French will continue to talk to you. Thank you very much. We're going to check back in with the alderman and also with our reporter on the ground, those protests in St. Louis throughout the night. Up next, President Trump has a new target in the media tonight. ESPN anchor Jemele Hill, why he is now asking for an apology from her. Plus, Jose is back to hurricane strength with a new track that could bring it back toward the U.S. We'll tell you where it's headed. All the models ahead. Well, yet again, the President of the United States is targeting a media figure on Twitter, this time ESPN anchor Jemele Hill. It started when she recently tweeted, quote, "Donald Trump is a white supremacist who has largely surrounded himself with other white supremacists." The comment sparked a firestorm, as you might imagine, especially among conservative media outlets, which have criticized ESPN for years for what they see as a liberal political bent. This morning, the president tweeted this, apparently referring to Hill. Quote, "ESPN is paying a really big price for its politics and bad programming. People are dumping it in record numbers. Apologize for untruth." Yesterday, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said that what Jemele Hill said was a fireable offense. From the podium today, she stood by those remarks and said that ESPN has been hypocritical and should hold anchors to a fair and consistent standard. Joining me now is CNN political commentators Bakari Sellers and Scott Jennings. Bakari, it seems to me there are two angles on this to discuss. First of all, should the White House be going after someone directly because they expressed a personal opinion on Twitter? And then there's also the decision by ESPN and what she said. So does it make sense to you that I mean, is it appropriate for the White House to be saying that this is a fireable offense?
Absolutely not. It's not appropriate for the White House to go after a private company, a private individual, and talk about that it's a fireable offense. I mean, we can go down the list of fireable offenses in the White House, but even more importantly, we have to talk about the fact that her right is protected in the First Amendment. I thought it was conservatives. I thought it was the Republican Party who got in a tizzy day after day, and we just saw it in Charlottesville where they were having a free speech rally or free speech march. And so it kind of catches me off balance and off guard when all of a sudden Sarah Huckabee Sanders wants to attack Jemele Hill. But to actually get to the substance of what she said, I dare anyone to tell me where she lied. She did not speak an untruth. Jemele Hill spoke her truth. And for anyone to come up here and not have the ability to stand in the shoes of an African-American woman who was talking about sports under that light and have the ability to simply say that she was speaking her truth and let her do that, then it's very audacious for any of us to criticize her. Even more so, more audacious for Donald Trump to do so.
Scott, I mean, the White House telling a company that what their employee has said is a fireable offense, does that concern you?
It concerns me. I don't think the government ought to be weighing in on private sector personnel decisions. Look, I'm a conservative. I want the free market to determine who's hired and fired out there in the private marketplace. And that's really the issue here. She is protected by the Constitution. She has a right to speak her mind, but she's not free of the consequences of that speech. And so she serves in a public role for a network that has to decide if they want their Sports Center anchors out there, you know, essentially pissing off half the country, which is what she did with her tweet. So I think she has a right to speak. I don't think she's necessarily protected from the consequences of that speech, although it seems tonight that ESPN has decided to lightly reprimand her and move on.
Well, you know, Bakari, I mean, Sarah Sanders said something today that I think a lot of people agree with, certainly conservatives agree with, that ESPN has been hypocritical, that they should hold anchors to a fair and consistent standard. They've let go people who said things they took issue with. Curt Schilling, I believe, had made comments about transgender bathrooms. Linda Cohn was, I believe, disciplined for expressing her opinions about ESPN programming and business deals.
Yeah, and Linda Cohn was reprimanded, and so was Jemele Hill. She was reprimanded. But the comparison between her and Curt Schilling is a fallacy, and it's a flaw, and it's intellectually dishonest, and I'm glad you brought it up. Because Curt Schilling, he not only came out against transgenders, he also came out against Muslim Americans. He also said Hillary Clinton should be buried underneath a jail. So he not only had one bite against the public policy apparatus at CNN, but he had three. I mean, Curt Schilling is an awesome picture, but he's also borderline racist. And so I think that ESPN was right in their justification with Curt Schilling, because you had three instances with him. Jemele Hill actually said something, and Scott will not refute it. I don't know who will. She did not speak an untruth. And listen, guys, I mean, we're sitting here, we're three men, and we're talking about an African-American woman in Trump's America. I mean, what she's going through right now, speaking sports, where most people think she needs to sit in her place, where she needs to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. She's talking about sports. She's talking about it from her perspective, and she's speaking her truth. Let her live that truth. And if people don't want to watch ESPN because of Jemele Hill, so be it. I got 3 or 4 more friends who will stand with her.
Scott, I mean, the president tweeting about this is part of it just him trying to please his base, and you know, time he's receiving criticism from his base about DACA, that this is, you know, this is a tried and true thing, attacking someone in the media.
Well, the president's had great success turning the guns on the media. He's done it, of course, to CNN, as we're all well aware here. He's doing it to ESPN. This is part of a political strategy. And look, a great many of his supporters do believe there is a vast media conspiracy out there to try to undermine this president. I do think it is important to address the substance of her tweets. She is welcome to her opinion. I don't have a problem with people expressing their opinion. I do think she impugned the character of a great many people. She said that he surrounds himself with white supremacists. I mean, I think if Ben Carson and Elaine Chao, members of the president's cabinet, were told they were white supremacists, they'd be pretty darn surprised to learn that. And so she's welcome to her opinion. The free market here has to rule. I think ESPN has to decide, is half the country worth making mad over a political issue when she's supposed to be, you know, talking about sports? Again, I agree. right to free speech. I just don't know how you make a business decision to make everybody that supports President Trump angry and give them the excuse to turn your network off.
We were going to leave it there. I said Sarah Sanders called Jemele Hill's remarks a fireable offense yesterday. It was actually Wednesday she first said that, and she stood by it today. Bakari Sellers, Scott Jennings, guys, thanks very much. When we come back, Jose has now been upgraded to a hurricane. We'll tell you where in the United States it may hit. We're watching closely protests taking place in St. Louis. You're looking at two different viewpoints of it. Several hundred people have been marching now through the streets. There had been, according to Dan Simon, who's in there with the protesters, they had been thinking about trying to cut off a freeway. It looked like the police were out in a heavy presence in order to stop them from getting onto the freeway. It's not clear where they are headed now or how organized it is. We've got reporters on the ground. We'll go back to them shortly. First, though, about 1.5 million people are still without power in Florida after Hurricane Irma tore through the state. But already there's another hurricane that could impact the U.S. Jose regained strength today, was upgraded back to a Category 1 hurricane. Allison Chinchar is in the Weather Center with a look at the potential path. So what do we know about this, Allison?
Well, what we know is a lot of things are going to be changing in the next 24 hours. Already, we've started with the fact that it's upgraded back to a Category 1 hurricane. Winds right now about 75 miles per hour. As it progresses north, it's actually going to expand in overall size. Tomorrow, it's actually very likely, the National Hurricane Center say, that they will issue tropical storm watches for areas of North Carolina, because as this gets bigger, some of those outer bands are likely to interact with it. Then as it goes even further north, say timing around Wednesday morning-ish, it'll be about 225 miles east of New York City. Keep in mind, the margin of error for the cone is also 225 miles, which means cities like New York and Boston will likely still be well within that area of reason for potential Tuesday and Wednesday of next week.
So, I mean, is the Northeast the only part of the U.S. that may be affected by this?
That's a great question, and the answer is actually no. So let's take a look, because here's the storm. As it continues to push up towards the north, it's actually going to push all of that water towards the eastern seaboard, which means, Anderson, that everyone from Maine all the way down towards Florida will at minimum have the potential for incredibly strong rip currents. Then the further north you get, say from North Carolina up to Maine, there's also the potential for an actual landfall as well.
All right, Allison, thanks for the latest. I appreciate that. Allison Chinchar. We've been following the situation, as I said, in St. Louis. Protesters started gathering this afternoon. Now they've been marching. It comes after a judge found a former police officer not guilty in the shooting death of an African-American man, Anthony Lamar Smith, back in 2011. Ryan Young joins us now with the latest from St. Louis. So last hour, Ryan, the protesters were trying to march onto a freeway, hoping to shut it down. What's happening now?
Yeah, Anderson, we've been with these protesters at about 11 o'clock this afternoon. This is the largest gathering that we've had so far. And in fact, they're right next to a hospital. That's a critical need point, obviously. One of the things they have done, though, is when an ambulance tried to get through here, they did move out of the way for that ambulance to get to the hospital. But you can feel the energy and the vibe from these protesters. I want to say, for the most part, it hasn't been violent protests. We did have some moments of violence earlier today when some protesters were being moved from in front of a bus that was carrying police officers. That got very tense. In fact, there was pepper spray used on those protesters. People kind of pushed back. Officers pushed back. We know 13 arrests have been made. 4 officers were assaulted. But the real thing here is, if you look at the crowd, look at it. Look how diverse this crowd is. I don't think when we were covering Ferguson that we would ever imagine that a majority crowd of white people would be carrying signs that say Black Lives Matter. So there is a big mix here in terms of how people are walking amongst everyone, having a conversation about how they want justice turned. We're going to flip around a little bit, Anderson, so you can see this, because look, you can see the medical campus breezeway right there. You can see these signs. There's obviously a large number of young people here who have started to participate in this. They definitely want to make sure that their voices are heard.
Ryan,
they say they want changes, and they believe the video.
Ryan, if you could tell us, just in terms of the police presence now, it seemed like earlier they were kind of taking a hands-off approach, which is what we've seen in often these kind of mobile marches that don't necessarily have permits, that the police often do that so that they're not trying to in any way end up with some sort of confrontation. Is that the strategy right now, please?
And that's what it seems like. And in fact, the only confrontation we had was at that moment when the buses were being stopped. Outside of that, we haven't had that back and forth between police officers and protesters. In fact, when they tried to go to the interstate, they just kind of stood there and kind of waited to see what was going to happen and yelled at the officers. The officers stood their ground, but there was no pushing and shoving at all. That only happened when the bicycle cops came in earlier and tried to remove people. At this point, we are just marching. I heard Dan talking earlier about there was no plan here. I will tell you, around 12 o'clock, we were told they were coming to the suburbs, that they wanted people in this neighborhood to feel the pain of poor people on the other side of town. They definitely believe that if you're poor or have some issues or you're urban, that you're not going to be represented in this city or this country, and they want to make sure their voices are heard. So you're seeing this happen in real time with the shirts and with people with signs. And this has been going on. Look, you can hear a guy right now with a cane who's walking with these protesters. It's been very interesting to watch the mix of people who've shown up here tonight, Anthony.
Yeah, Ryan, appreciate that. We'll continue to check in with you. I also want to check in with our Dan Simon, who's also at another part of the protest. I'm not sure how close you are to Ryan. Dan, what have you been seeing?
Well, so far, Anderson, the crowd has been very peaceful. We're seeing people of all ages, a lot of young people, also some seniors as well. And right now, police are not impeding their progress. And they're taking a hands-off posture, and we're just walking with this crowd. Quite frankly, we have no idea where they're going. They're holding signs. They're chanting slogans. You see people with the Black Lives Matter sign. And this is the Central West End part of St. Louis. There are a lot of restaurants and bars down the street that they're walking onto now. This is Euclid Avenue for folks who are familiar with the St. Louis area. And obviously there is the concern about what may happen tonight and what may happen this week. And I can tell you that authorities seem to be very prepared for any type of violence that might break out. Obviously, they've drawn some lessons with what happened in Ferguson. We know that the Missouri governor has the National Guard on standby, and obviously lots of police out here. Police are working 12-hour shifts, as we said earlier. Many had their vacations or personal days canceled. But for now, this crowd just walking totally unimpeded, and one person told me that they plan on staying out here all night, Anderson.
And then you were saying they're walking toward Euclid Avenue. That's an area where there are a lot of bars and restaurants. So, because it seemed like Ryan was saying earlier that they had maybe been wanting to go to a more suburban area. This is more of a business area?
This is a business area. There's a lot of nightlife on this street, and perhaps that's why they're going here. And hold on, I'm just listening to what this guy is saying. He's saying that there's some people on in wheelchairs and to slow down. I just lost IFB, Anderson, so I can no longer hear you. But I tell you what, there are several hundred people out here, and looks like this is going to go on throughout the night. Anderson.
Right. Dan, we'll continue to check in with you. With me now is former St. Louis Alderman Antonio French and former Missouri GOP Chairman Ed Martin. Antonio, given the facts of this case, I mean, are you surprised at the verdict of not guilty? Because again, for people just following it, this was a shooting that took place in 2011. Prosecutors brought charges. This person left the police force. Prosecutors said that there was some kind of new evidence that led them to bring charges. There were allegations not only of the police officer shooting this person 5 times, but also planting a weapon because part of his claim on shooting was that he believed the driver was reaching for a gun. So were you surprised by the verdict?
Well, you know, given the history of these kind of cases and what the Missouri law is right now, I'm not surprised by the verdict. I am disappointed, though. The prosecutors felt they had a strong case, especially given video evidence, the audio evidence, the DNA evidence, and so we were hopeful that the system would work this time. What you're seeing now is people taking to the streets to voice their displeasure and feeling once again that the system is not working for average citizens.
Ed, this incident was captured on video. I wonder, are you surprised at the increase of police body cams and video? You know, do you believe it's going to lead to more convictions? Do you think it's going to lead to more vindication for police officers?
Yeah, I sure hope more cameras lead to more transparency. I think that's a really good thing. I do want to make one observation. I think Antonio might agree with this. There has been a different kind of presence with law enforcement and the National Guard here. I think there's a lot more room for the protesters to be peaceful and all. But look, I was Republican chairman. You mentioned the judge in this case was a Republican appointee, 28 years on the bench. If you look at the case, the ruling, he lays it out. It's, as Antonio said, maybe people wish it was a different decision. It's not outside of what the facts were. And I think the story here is that the prosecutor who charged this as murder one, this guy was the guy that was killed had some records. He was clearly had been in trouble and was not a choir boy perhaps, but she charged it wrong. I think Antonio might agree. And the prosecutor set this up where she put all her chips in the center and said, convict on murder one. And the judge said, I can't do that. And there may have been other possibilities, but frankly, she played politics, I think, to play to the Black Lives Matter kind of movement in St. Louis, and she lost that case because of it. I think
Antonio,
that's part of it.
I want you to be able to respond to that.
Well, I disagree a little bit with Ed about those facts, but I'll say this, is that the Circuit Attorney's Office is part of the system as well. And so if you think that there was a mistake made on the Circuit Attorney's part, the people's in the streets response is the same, is that the system did not work. And while Ed was careful to point out the faults of the young man who was killed, Anthony Smith, this officer also, we need to agree, was a bad cop. This is a cop who shows up to the scene with an AK-47. This is an officer who makes statements that we are going to kill this MF just before he does kill this guy. And he was released from the department, not fired, but allowed to retire. But this was a bad cop, and we need to be able to say that. And what people are asking for is a level of accountability. When a bad cop takes the life of a citizen, there needs to be some way we can get some accountability in the system.
But we don't. Let me just say, we don't get to call someone a bad cop based on your description. I mean, the guy that was killed, the 34-year-old, he wasn't a kid. He was convicted twice of gun crimes and twice of drug crimes. And this cop was accused of a crime. This cop was accused of a crime and was acquitted today. Other than that, you're saying he's a bad guy.
This cop was released from the police department. Released from the police department, and the city of St. Louis had to pay almost $1 million for what this cop did. So let's not forget those facts.
You know, I just don't think you can call him a bad cop.
I want to bring in Jeff Roeder of the...
Well, that's a problem. We can't even agree on that. This is how far we're apart.
Stay tuned. Stay with us, if you will. I just want to bring in Jeff Roeder of the St. Louis Police Officers Association. First of all, Jeff, just in terms of a protest like this and the strategy for police, it does seem like that it's very much kind of hands off, kind of let the protest continue, whether they have a permit or not, and kind of avoid any confrontation unless they're trying to shut down a highway or something like that. Is that basically the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say let them have their space, but you know, if they're gathered on a street and traffic can get around through other arteries, you know, why not let them just have that space where you can contain them and monitor them and keep things safe? I mean, I think that's the approach. And you know, the cops on the ground, they have ever-changing tactics that are really dictated by the behavior of the crowd.
And Jeff, I'm wondering, were you surprised by this verdict?
I was not. You know, I sat through almost that entire trial. If you read the judge's very well-reasoned, extensive decision, you not only understand why he found Jason not guilty, you should be able to understand why everyone should find him free of guilt in this case.
So, Jeff, when the officer said, you know, I'm going to kill this MF, and then actually does, I think the counter argument to that is, well, look, a lot of people say things in the heat of a moment, in the heat of a chase, and this was a chase that went on, a vehicle chase. Was that the sort of the explanation for those comments?
Yeah, and you know, the judge makes that comment that people say things in the heat of the moment, and you have to take them for what they're worth and what happens afterwards. But you know, the comments that Stockley makes in the car as they're chasing him are after this suspect has already tried to run over he and his partner, and they've seen a gun inside of his car, and he's engaged in some very dangerous driving on pretty populous city streets. You know, so he was trying to get his young partner, not long out of the police academy's head in the game and make him understand this is a serious situation. And the words that probably preceded that were, if he does this again, or if he points that gun at us, we're probably going to have to do this.
So, Antonio, is that the evidence you saw?
No, not at all. And when you read this judge's opinion, it seems that he goes to great lengths to try to rationalize some of the language that this officer uses. You would not imagine the judge would use the same kind of leeway when it comes to an average citizen. If an average citizen said, "I am going to kill somebody," and then kills them 1 minute later, we would say that that was premeditation. And so it is tough to imagine now that how you prove premeditation if you disregard the person actually saying, "I am going to kill you," before they kill you. So what is premeditation then?
Jeff, I want you to be able to respond, and then we have to go.
Well, it was self-defense. As Antonio well knows, the subject was armed with a gun, wouldn't show his hands. The officer was reaching for the gun that the officers knew was there. If that's not self-defense, I don't know what is.
All right, gentlemen, thanks very much. We're going to keep an eye on St. Louis. Up next, British officials are warning another terror attack could be imminent after today's London subway bombing. The latest from London in a moment. Today, a terror attack in London, and tonight, a new warning for Britain. A massive manhunt is underway in that country after an explosion on a crowded London subway train. Britain's Prime Minister is saying another attack could be imminent.
The Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, that's the independent organisation which is responsible for setting the threat level on the basis of available intelligence, has now decided to raise the national threat level from severe to critical. This means that their assessment is that a further attack may be imminent.
Well, the explosion came from what's being referred to as a bucket bomb. The video shows it still burning there. Officials say they're lucky the bomb did not detonate properly. If it had, the damage obviously could have been much worse. At least 29 people were injured, though, this morning. Thankfully, no critical injuries. You may know this is the 5th terror attack in Britain this year alone, and so far there have been no arrests in connection with this attack. Our Matthew Chance joins us from London. So what is the latest on the manhunt? Because, Matthew, I mean, there's so many surveillance cameras in the subway system, on streets in England. They must be looking over all of that to track down this person who obviously was bringing this large device onto a subway.
Absolutely. It's almost certain that the individuals that planted this device would have been caught on surveillance cameras at some point during their, sort of involvement in the transport system in London. There are 12,000 CCTV cameras just in the London transport system alone. And then, of course, there are thousands more on the streets around every metro station, every tube station, and in other streets as well. It's one of the most closely scrutinised cities in the world. And so, doubtlessly, there are specialised officers who will be poring over those images over the course of the past, 17, 18 hours now, trying to build up a picture of what happened, trying to identify suspects. Now, in terms of that investigation, the police are keeping their lips very tightly sealed about what progress they're making. They're saying they're making excellent progress, but they're not saying exactly what that progress is. They're saying because of the nature of the investigation, much of it has to be done covertly, so they don't want to come out in public and say what progress